Cool. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to those who are here live and to those who are following on the Zoom system. As I've mentioned before, I'm still learning a little bit how to balance the eye contact and everything else with the two groups. For those who are here live, I've given out a source sheet. For those who have joined via Zoom, I've just posted a link to download a very simple source sheet on the topic that we're addressing tonight. Now, this is the second part of a shiur on Shmitta. I spoke on Shabbos Shuvah in a first part, and there I dealt with the fundamentals of the halacha. We had a look at the psukim, which I've reprinted on the source sheet, the basic psukim which teach us the halachas of Shmitta, and we discussed the fundamental ideas, the basic halachic framework. We also looked at how Shmitta is kept in the 21st century in Eretz Yisrael. We looked at the various ways it's kept and some of the halachic solutions, controversies, debates around different ways of keeping it, and around some of the halachic divides in respect of that. I also began discussing how this affects us here in Chutz La'aretz and what we need to know about Shmitta. And today I would like to talk a little bit more about that. What do we need to know about Shmitta on a practical level living here in England? And also, if we have time, try and look in more halachic detail at some of the sort of more niche halachic debates and new technologies that are out there. So firstly, just to remind ourselves, the halachas of Shmitta have a number of sections. One halacha that we're not going to discuss and didn't discuss in the Shabbos Shuvah drasha is the halacha that's applicable at the end of Shmitta, Shmittas Kasofim, the nullification or cancellation of loans. Maybe that's something that we can discuss near the end of the year. But when we look at the agricultural halachas, there's a prohibition on farming, or at least certain aspects and forms of farming. There is the ownership of the produce grown in over the year of Shmitta that grows by itself, which is effectively hefka of sorts, accessible and available to anyone to take for themselves. And then there are various prohibitions on the fruit or vegetables that have grown in Shmitta. Now, as far as Torah law is concerned, any fruit or vegetable that grows in Shmitta must not be ne'evad. The farm is not allowed to have worked to produce it. It shall not be shomor. It shall not be guarded. In other words, it should be accessible to anyone who wishes to help themselves to it. And in addition, it needs to be treated with kedusha, with sanctity as to how it is consumed. This is as far as Torah law is concerned. Similarly, as far as Torah law is concerned, if we look in the psukim that we have on our source sheet, you will see that the prohibition is against zoreah, sowing seed, in other words, planting seeds in the ground. The pasuk also mentions pruning. It doesn't mention other agricultural acts. So this is pasuk Gimel in Vayikra, in Parshas behind Vayikra Chafei, in the source sheet. Sheishonim tizra saldecha, sheishonim tizra kamecha. For the 6 years you can engage in zoreah, in sowing seeds, and in zemira, in pruning. However, in Shmitta, pasuk Daled, one should not do sodchalo sizra v'chamachalo sizra. One should neither sow nor prune. So, to what degree we extend these agricultural prohibitions further, as far as Torah law is concerned, and as far as rabbinic law is concerned, remains somewhat of a debate. So sowing and pruning is certainly forbidden. Presumably, and this is a machlokas, but it may well be that planting a sapling is equivalent to zoreah. So, for example, in the Ovus Malachos of Shabbos and 39 prohibited Shabbos Malachos, it is considered one category to both sow a seed and plant a sapling. With trees we plant saplings, with seeds we sow. Ploughing also, according to many poskim, is included in the Doraisa, in the Torah prohibition, and various other agricultural activities would appear to be D'Rabbanan, though Rav Kook was of the view that even though specific actions may only be drabanon, nonetheless ongoing agricultural activities are Torah prohibitions, at least as far as the Torah is concerned in terms of what takes place in Eretz Yisrael. So these are the Torah prohibitions: agricultural activity to a greater or lesser extent, keeping the crop for oneself, not leaving it open, guarding the crop, and treating the fruit and vegetable with the sanctity, with kedusha of Shmitta. Now we're going to have to unpick, if you excuse the pun, each one of these and look at them in greater detail and understand how they can affect us in Chutz La'aretz, and also look at some of the drabanon, rabbinic prohibitions associated with that. Did you want to ask something, or I wasn't sure if you know?
No, I was wondering if you were talking about today, I was saying they're still midaraisa.
No. So this is when Shmitta was in full force. How that applies nowadays again is a little different. You are correct. It's drabanon. Now also, so these are the deraisa prohibitions. In addition, there is a universally agreed upon prohibition against eating vegetables or grains which grow by themselves over Shmitta. As far as Torah law is concerned, any fruit or vegetable that grows by itself should be allowed. Drabanon, they prohibited sfichin, which means vegetables and grains which grow by themselves. And the reason for this is that whilst fruit that grow on a tree grow year by year, even without the farmer doing anything, vegetables and grains normally only grow because the farmer has actually planted them. It is true that due to planting that takes place before Shemitah, or grains and seeds which are left in the ground just randomly, things grow over Shemitah, and therefore there could be a small quantity of grains and vegetables that grow over Shemitah. Nonetheless, because we are worried and concerned about farmers planting these, there is an Issa Drabanon, a rabbinic prohibition, against any vegetables that grow in the Shemitah year. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means that fruit and vegetables that we get from Eretz Yisrael, we need to identify what their source is. If they are growing from Jewish lands in Eretz Yisrael, then everyone would agree that the Shmitta laws apply, in which case if they are fruit, they need to be eaten with the laws of Shmitta in mind, and if they are vegetable or grains, they are certainly prohibited. If they grow from non-Jewish land, then as far as the Ikar Hadin is concerned, as we discussed on Shabbos, this does not have Kedusha Shvius. We discussed the very significant Machlokas Rishonim around this point, very old argument, dates back several hundred years, as to whether Eretz Yisrael means land owned by Yisrael, or it means the geographical space that has Kedusha Sa'aretz, whether it is or isn't owned by a Jew. But la halacha, if it is owned by a non-Jew, it does not have Kedushas Shavias. And then we discussed on Shabbos the Heter Mechira, the solution of taking Jewish-owned land and selling it to a non-Jew for Shemitah, and how that works and the debates around that. So if one has in Chutz La'aretz, or in Eretz Yisrael for that matter, fruit which has Kedushas Shavias, which has been grown on Jewish land, we now need to investigate further and check whether it has grown in a permitted manner or in a non-permitted manner. Meaning to say, is this fruit which has grown by itself, in which case, and the farmer has kept the halachas of Shmitta, and it is hefka, it's been released to anyone, and it has been picked personally by an individual who is sharing it out and making it accessible to anyone, then it is perfectly permissible to eat, as long as it is eaten with the kedusha of Shmitta. Similarly, if it is distributed through the arrangement called Oitza Based In, which I discussed in detail on Shabbos Shuvah again in my Shiur, then again it would be permitted to be eaten because it has been collected and picked by the agents of Based In and distributed by the agents of Based In, very often employing the farmers and the lorry drivers and the shopkeepers that normally would engage in agricultural practice, that they have some panasa, they have some livelihood over Shemitah, and it is then distributed in the normal fruit shops. The difference is that they are not skimming a profit off this because this fruit is owned by everyone at Tefka. It doesn't belong to anyone, but they are paid a basic salary for their work. And this will then be distributed in the fruit shops rather than sold, and money will still be exchanged hands. Money will still be given to the shopkeeper, not as payment for the fruit because the fruit is Hefka, belongs to everyone, it has Kedusha Shmitta, but rather just distributed and payment for the labor. And again, there are shops in Israel which sell or distribute fruits through Oitzer Beis Din, and one should ensure that these fruits that are purchased from shops that have a reliable hechsher, which has come to an Oitzer Beis Din arrangement in accordance with the halacha. And in general, one would expect such fruit to be at least a third to a half cheaper than normal sold fruit, because there's no profit being made. Now, which of these Oitzer Beis Din fruits might reach us in Chutz La'aretz? And the answer is, in general, only two types of products from this Oitzer Beis Din, in other words, from this Jewish-grown but distributed fruit. And these are bottles of wine and esrogim next Sukkot. So esrogim we're not going to talk about again. We have a year off for that. Indeed, we have quite a lot of time for a lot of fruit and vegetables that take time to get to the market. But the other thing that arrives in the market are bottles of wine which are sold with the Kedusha of Shmitta through the Oitzer Beis Din arrangement. When do we have to start being concerned about fruit and vegetable from Israel and potentially having the Kedusha of Shmitta? Whether the Oitzer Beis Din system, or whether it's prohibited Shmitta produced vegetables or permitted Shmitta produced fruit, but one which needs to be treated with Kedusha Shmitta. So the answer is with vegetables pretty quickly, with fruit several months. And again, on my Shabbos Shuvah Drasha and in the email that I distributed to the community, I gave a link to the London Beis Din's website where they give the dates of each fruit and vegetable and when it comes onto the market. And there are certainly vegetables and spice and herbs and so on which are coming from Israel, which already have the Kedusha of Shmitta. For those of you who haven't seen the email, definitely worth a look, and there's a very clear halakhic guidance around these matters. So this is fruit which is now coming from Israel. If it is vegetables, it is presumed prohibited. If it is fruit, it is, if it's Oitzer Beis Din wine, it would be permitted. And if it is fruit that is being exported from Israel, then we need to analyze and think a little bit about what its halakhic status is, which we will now do in a moment. But again, I think you wanted to ask something.
Just on the point you made earlier about the Oitzer Beis Din, was the produce is distributed and it eventually reaches a shop. Nobody along that chain is allowed to make a profit, did you say?
Correct.
But you're allowed to be paid
for a wage for the expenses involved and for the labour involved. So Oitzer Beis Din can't be sold as a profit, but one can pay something.
You can pay yourself a salary from it.
Correct, yes, a salary can be paid. The salary would be paid by Beis Din and acting as their agents to distribute the fruit. I'm skimming over this a little bit because I dealt with it in more depth on when I spoke on Shabbos. So what's the status of the fruit and vegetables that arrive on our shores here in England? So we cannot assume that it is heter mechira. And in addition, as I mentioned when I spoke on Shabbos, the mainstream psak halacha from all the large Botei Din and kashrus authorities in Chutz La'aretz, whether the OU, whether KLBD, whether the Federation, and the various other large American hechsherim, and in line with Rav Soloveitchik's view in America, is that in Chutz La'aretz there's no reason we should even enter into the heter mechira debate. It's a machlokas, an argument for those who are agriculturists and citizens of Eretz Yisrael. It's not something that we should be drawn into, and therefore for us we have to assume that the fruit and vegetable we are getting has Kedushas Shemitta. So if the fruit and vegetable that we're buying, indeed it comes from Eretz Yisrael, if it is vegetable it would need to be disposed of, and disposed of with covered with respect for its sanctity as Kedusha Shmitta, and therefore should be double wrapped before it is put in the bin, or in with fruit which will be disposed of again with covered, because it is okay. Can I be heard? Can someone give me a nod?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I hopefully now this will work. We're doing it via someone's mobile phone. Okay. Thank you. So vegetable, as I said, should be assumed to have Kedusha Shmitta and therefore would be forbidden drabanan and should be disposed of by double wrapping and putting in the bin. Some of you may have heard that already 5 times, and for others of you maybe that's new. Fruit should be treated with Kedushas Shmitta. Now, what is the status of this fruit? Well, the fruit is, I'm just getting feedback. If everyone can just mute themselves. Alan and Michael, if you can just mute yourselves, if you don't mind. Okay, thank you. So fruit should be treated with kedusha of Shmitta. Now, what's the status of this fruit? Well, the fruit has been presumably farmed by a farmer, unless we have a way of knowing that this fruit has a hechsher. The fruit being sold in our shops in Chutz La'aretz presumably does not have a hechsher, and we cannot be certain that it has the heter mechira either. And as I said, our practice in Chutz La'aretz is not to rely on the heter mechira. And therefore, our assumption is it has been farmed be'issa against the halachas of Shmitta. In addition, it has been sold in the shops, and fruit and vegetables are not meant to be sold in regular shops. Finally, it has been shomor, it has been guarded and not declared as hefka by the farmer. So what is the status of fruit which is shomor and nervad, which has been sold in the shops, which has been guarded and has been grown through the transgression of Shmitta by regular farming practice? This is a machlokus between Rashi and Rabbi Tam. Rashi and his grandson, Rabbi Tam, who was one of the preeminent Bali Tosfos, as to whether such fruit is prohibited or not. In the situation in which one ends up buying such fruit, one can assume it is mutter, and therefore eat it with the sanctity, with the kedusha of Shmitta, even though l'chatchila, in the first instance, one should not have bought the fruit. Why should one not have bought the fruit? Because it has kedusha Shmitta, and kedusha Shmitta, kedusha shvius, is not meant to be sold in a regular manner. It's meant to be hefka, it's meant to be available for everyone. If I've now bought it by mistake because I didn't realize when I made my fruit order or something of the sort, and I've ended up with produce from Eretz Yisrael, if it is vegetables, it's prohibited because of the issa of slichin. If it's fruit, it has been grown at the issa, it's been harvested, it's been shomor and nervad, it hasn't been declared hefka. I shouldn't have purchased it, but now that I've done so, we may adopt the lenient stance and assume that shomor and nervad is mutter, and therefore I would eat it with the kedusha of Shmitta. So this is the explanation of why in my letter, in my guidelines, I wrote that with fruit, if we have the fruit, we should eat it with the kedusha of Shmitta. What does this mean, that it should be eaten with the kedusha of Shvius? Well, the first point is it should be eaten and not disposed of, not wasted. So one should try and use the fruit fully. That means within reason, within a normal manner. So if it's normal to peel it, one can peel the fruit. However, one shouldn't needlessly dispose of it. One shouldn't just waste a piece of the fruit and chuck it out. If one is coring an apple, one should try and eat the apple to the fullest extent, and it should be used in a normal manner. The Pasuk says that Shmitta fruit is allowed to be eaten. If we look again in our Psukim, it describes this fruit as lochem. This fruit can be for you. This fruit is allowed to be used for Hoysa Shabbos Oretz. Lochem. This should be a Sabbath of the land. Pasuk Vav, Pasuk 6 in the source sheet. Lochem, for you, la'ochla, to eat. So we are allowed to eat the fruit. However, it should only be used for its primary and typical purposes. So if it is fruit which is edible for a human being, it shouldn't be given to pets. It shouldn't be fed to animals because this is fruit which is meant to be eaten for humans. Similarly, if it is normally eaten as a whole fruit, one shouldn't eat it as a soup or juice it into a juice because it is designed and meant to be eaten for its primary purpose. So fruits which are normal to juice would be allowed to be juiced. Fruits which are not normally juiced are not allowed to be juiced. There's an argument whether this means that only olives and grapes can be juiced, because these are the classic fruits in the times of Tanakh and the Torah that we use for juice, and all other fruits were eaten, or whether it refers to any commonly juiced fruits, which would include apple and oranges and pomegranates and lemons and so on. And again, we can take the lenient position on this, and any fruit which is commonly juiced would be allowed to be juiced. But basically, the halacha is that such fruit should be eaten in the normal manner, shouldn't be fed to animals, shouldn't be destroyed. If there's any excess Shmitta fruit that you have that you are unable to eat, then again it should be double wrapped and disposed of or put in the green bin and therefore treated again with covered. Peels which are commonly eaten, like apple peels, again, should be eaten. Peels which are not commonly eaten, like orange peels and so on, don't need to be eaten. So this is the halacha of fruit which has arrived in England with the kedusha of Shavuos. Wine which arrives in England with the kedusha of Shavuos with a good hechsher will be oatza based in. the shop selling it needs to know what it's doing. It needs to understand it is not selling the wine, it is distributing it, and it's not skimming a profit off for so doing. It's simply passing on the basic expenses to the consumer. And again, such wine needs to be eaten or drunk with the Kedusha of Shmitta. For example, if you're making Havdalah with the wine, you shouldn't spill it over the cup, as many have the practice to do, because this would be wasting Shmitta wine, and therefore it should be eaten, consumed fully. There is a final halacha, which in general doesn't apply because of the way distribution works in Chutz La'aretz, which is once the fruit has run out in the field, it is no longer available in the field, we are not allowed to hoard it at home. And this is the halacha referred to as biur Shmitta, biur Shvius, that fruit from Shvius has to be declared hefka. If you think about biur chometz, we declare our chometz hefka before Pesach. So this is a parallel idea of biur Shmitta, that if you possess fruit which is no longer available in the field in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, we are not allowed to hoard it at home, and therefore we need to declare it hefka. For most fruits, this doesn't apply, because when we get it in Chutz La'aretz, in general, it's still available in agriculturally in Eretz Yisrael. However, if one has wine, for example, a long time after Shmitta, the concept of biur, of declaring a hefka, may apply, and it all depends on exactly when the wine was bought and whether it was still under the auspices of the Beis Din at the time one bought it or not. So if you end up with Shmitta wine, consult a competent rabbi to discuss whether the halacha of biur, of not hoarding it but declaring it hefka and available to anyone who needs it, would apply in this scenario. So one does need to sort of be cognizant of the halachas of Shmitta if one is buying fruit from Eretz Yisrael. If one ends up accidentally buying fruit from Eretz Yisrael that has the Kedusha of Shmitta. That, I think that answers the question there also. What else do we need to know about Shmitta here in Chutz La'aretz? So I want to highlight 2 points. One of them was actually mentioned on Friday night, so I'll just mention it briefly again. And that is for those who are lucky enough to own a property in Eretz Yisrael, and perhaps property with a garden. So if you have a garden to your property in Eretz Yisrael, you need to be cognizant of 2 things. Number one, to brief the gardener and ensure that the gardener who might be maintaining your garden is aware of the halachas of Shmitta. What can and can't the gardener do? The answer is they can do basic maintenance to avoid damage. However, they can't do anything which is creative. So whilst they can't plant a new tree, they can't sow seeds, they can't prune in order to ensure better growth of the tree. They can, however, engage in agricultural actions which are necessary to stop things getting ruined. So they can prune if it's necessary for the health of the tree, that the tree survives, that it doesn't get damaged, and they can water flowers and the grass and trees in order to ensure that they get enough water. They can spray them with insecticides and pesticides and the like if needs be, because these are things which are done to avoid damage to the tree or the ground rather than productively and creatively causing it to grow more. And again, a number of people in the community have consulted me if they have gardens in Israel, need a more detailed conversation to discuss specifics, but this is the broad outline. In addition, it's giving me low battery warnings there. In addition, the owner of a field in Eretz Yisrael needs to know if they have a fruit tree in their garden. And if you're lucky enough to have an orange or lemon or fruit tree in your garden, then again, the halachas of hefka would apply. You would need to ensure that anyone has access to the fruit growing on your tree in your garden. How do you ensure that? Well, if you have a farm or a field, the farmers leave the doors open and they let people go in. In your garden in Eretz Yisrael, you may not wish to do so because of security concerns and because you don't want everyone just to have access to the garden. And then you need to make alternative access arrangements. And there are a number of different ways of doing this. And again, people can consult me if this is relevant. For example, having a sign on the door with the contact details of someone who can let people in by arrangement would be allowed. You could have a set-aside time, an hour every day where your gardener or neighbor opens your garden and lets people in. It's possible that you could have the fruit collected and put in baskets for people to collect next to the garden gate. So there's a number of different solutions that can be found to allow access to your garden in a way that doesn't risk security, but also avoid you transgressing the prohibition of shamur, of guarding your garden and not granting access to anyone who needs to do so. So this is a second way that we in Chutz La'aretz have a connection to Eretz Yisrael and need to be cognizant of the halachas if one's lucky enough to own land in Eretz Yisrael. How else can we connect to Eretz Yisrael, and what else can we do? So traditionally, there have been many tzedakas that fundraise to support farmers in Eretz Yisrael and ensure that they can get through Shmitta. And these tzedakas are worthwhile. These are worthwhile causes to support. One needs to investigate, obviously, each tzedakah and understand its policies and how it works. But there are a number of very good and legitimate tzedakas. And again, this is an important way of connecting to Eretz Yisrael and supporting the farmers. Why do the farmers need support? So there's two layers to that question. First is hashkafic and philosophical. Surely the pasuk guarantees us, I'll give my bracha to Eretz Yisrael and ensure that it manages to get through the Shmitta without problems. And there are two answers to that question. One answer to that question is, it is correct. Hashem will ensure that Klal Yisrael can get through the Shmitta accordingly. And one of the ways he ensures Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, get through the Shmitta is by us supporting each other. As in many areas of life, we never know whether the wealth we are granted or because we are meant to appreciate and enjoy that wealth, or whether we are the conduits through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sending a shefa of bracha and support to Klal Yisrael. And if we wish to continue to be conduits, we need to ensure that we pass on some of the wealth that is gifted to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to worthy causes. And there are many worthy causes, and amongst them are the farmers in Eretz Yisrael. So this is the first answer. A second, more technical answer is that Shmitta nowadays is presumably d'Rabbanan, and it may be the miraculous bracha of keeping Shmitta only applies to Shmitta which is kept min ha-Torah. Shmitta which is nowadays rabbinic, and how we keep it, it is possible this bracha doesn't apply, and again, therefore, it is appropriate that we support the farmers. Why do farmers need support? Well, if they are fruit farmers, the support they need will be relatively limited. Why is that? Because of the Otzer basin solution that we discussed. They can become agents for basin and still make a basic salary through collecting and distributing the fruit to a consumer, though their income will be considerably less than in other years because they are being merely paid as farm hands rather than as owners, and they're not getting a share of the profit. So this is the Otzer basin solution, but it is correct to say that fruit farmers need less than others. They still need some support also because the quality of the fruit that grows over Shmitta is less, and the quantities are less because there isn't the farming taking place. One can maintain a garden or the like in order to ensure there isn't damage to the trees, to the capital, to the stock, but one isn't allowed to prune in order to ensure the quality of the fruit that grows in the trees, and therefore the pruning that normally farmers would engage in, for example, doesn't take place, and therefore fruit quality is less in Shmitta and quantity is less. The general rule is the farmers can only engage in that which is necessary for the health of avoiding damage to the land or the tree, but not to improve the quality of the fruit that's produced. If the farmer is a vegetable or grain farmer, then they will need considerable support because anything that grows is tzfichin, and they're not able to plant and they're not able to offer support accordingly in such a manner. If they are animal farmers, they may also need support because of difficulties in ensuring they get the feed which they normally use over Shmitta, that they can normally buy over Shmitta, which they'll need to buy in advance of Shmitta because of how we've explained the use of grain and Shmitta produce and tzfichin and so on. So husbandry animal farmers also need some support over Shmitta. And then there's a variety of other farmers, like spice farmers that have the prohibition of tzfichin, flour producers, which have some of the Shmitta prohibitions, and so on. And therefore, it is true in general that farmers do need support over Shmitta, and this is an appropriate tzedakah to give to. There's been a fascinating innovation, I think perhaps this Shmitta and perhaps the Shmitta before, in which the suggestion has been made that we in Chutz La'aretz can buy a small amount of land in Eretz Yisrael and through that fulfill the mitzvah of Shmitta. And I've seen a number of schemes advertising such arrangements. Is this something that one should take part in or not? So let's analyze exactly how these schemes work and what's going on over there. So what they do is they take a parcel of land and they sell a minimal quantity of land. They bundle it effectively into lots of packages, and each donor is gifted or purchases a small amount of land, and that land keeps the laws of Shmitta, and therefore, as such, we are keeping the laws of Shmitta here in distant England, far from Eretz Yisrael. We are nonetheless keeping the laws of Shmitta and allowing our land to lie fallow or to be hefka for anyone to help themselves to the fruit. Is this an appropriate project to embark on? So there's a number of technical questions and then a number of halachic and conceptual questions around this. The technical question is this a legitimate sale or not? And I discussed this when we looked at Het Mechira. Is this a real sale? Is it registered in the land registry in Israel, in the Tabor? Is there real gemar das? Is there real intent on the part of the seller to transfer ownership of the property to the buyer or not? So we need to look technically at how this is structured.
So it's just a year.
This is a year sale, yes, just a year sale. And then there is a conceptual question, which is one obligated to put oneself into a situation where one needs to keep a mitzvah? Now, there are mitzvahs which are chiyuvim, obligations. Rosh Hashanah comes, we have to listen to the shofar. There are other mitzvahs which are not mitzvahs chiyuvios, they're not obligations, they are mitzvah kiyumios. If you are in a certain situation, then you have to do the mitzvah. So if you eat bread of sufficient quantity, then you need to do Birchas Hamazon. Most of the time you don't need to eat a bread meal, and therefore you won't need to do Birchas Hamazon. If you eat a bread meal, then you will have to do Birchas Hamazon. These are mitzvah kiyumiyos. So some mitzvahs I say are obligations, others are, if you're in the situation, then you have to do the mitzvah. Is there a quality of avodas Hashem, of spirituality, or even an obligation to put oneself into a situation where you have to do a mitzvah? If you don't own a house, you don't have to put up a mezuzah. If you own a house, then you have to put up the mezuzah. Is there a reason to dwell in a house as opposed to a tent and have an obligation of mezuzah? Is there a reason to wear a four-cornered garment in order to have the mitzvah of tzitzis? The obligation of tzitzis is if you wear a four-cornered garment, you need to wear tzitzis. Do we need to put ourselves into that situation? Is there a reason to pursue a mitzvah kiyumis? So the classic source from this is a fascinating Gemara in the print this Gemara, I hope I did. Yes, in source 2 on the source sheet. This is Gemara in Menachos. And the Gemara says, Malacha source 2 in the source sheet, Malacha ashkechelu of Katina to Mechsi Sadina. An angel found Rav Katina who was wearing a cloak. So Rav Katina is a Amora, Gemara Rabbi, and he was wearing a linen cloak, and because it was linen, it was exempt from the mitzvah of tzitzis. And Rav Katina had some sort of spiritual or semi-prophetic experience in which he encountered a malach, an angel. And the angel said to him, Omale, the angel said to him, Katina, that was his name. Sedina b'kaitov, you wear a linen cloak in the summer, and a coat, which apparently in those days only had two corners and therefore was also exempt from tzitzis in the winter. What will be with the mitzvah of tzitzis? You'll end up never performing the mitzvah tzitzis. Amalei. So Rav Katina responded, I'm sure I'll say, am I going to be punished for a positive commandment? Meaning to say, this isn't an obligation. If you wear a four-cornered garment, then you should wear tzitzis. I'm choosing not to wear a four-cornered garment. What would be your problem? Answered the Malach, at a time of anger and divine judgment, we punish. Meaning to say that this Gemara is saying that even though there's no obligation to do a mitzvah kiyumis, a circumstantial mitzvah, nonetheless, if you avoid doing the mitzvah, that's not a good thing. You're showing a disregard, a disrespect for mitzvahs, and at a time of danger, you will lack the protection that these mitzvahs grant you. And this is the source of the idea that we wear tzitzis, choose to wear tzitzis, even though we're not obligated to so do. We could avoid wearing a four-cornered garment and not have to wear tzitzis, but that isn't our practice. Klal Yisrael has adopted tzitzis as a chiyuv. We deliberately wear four-cornered garments in order to ensure that we have this mitzvah. Now, there is discussion amongst the Rishonim as to the parameters of this idea. Do we really need to pursue every mitzvah? Should we be ensuring that every day we have a bread meal so that we can bench? Should we be ensuring that we put ourselves into a situation where we have to do mitzvahs or not? And many of the Rishonim, and this would appear to be the halacha, are of the view that this was a particular conversation about tzitzis, because the norm in those days was to wear robes with four corners, and therefore the Malach Surah of Katina is deliberately acting out of the norm to avoid the mitzvah, and that's inappropriate. That's a lack of respect for the mitzvah, says the Malach Surah of Katina. You are making yourself vulnerable by neglecting and disrespecting this mitzvah. However, mitzvahs which aren't part of normal life, and therefore it just happens to be that you're not keeping because of your life circumstances, you're not deliberately evading this mitzvah, wouldn't be included in this concept. So, for example, in times in which it was normal to always eat bread meals, if you deliberately avoided the bread meal because you couldn't be bothered to bench, that would be a neglect of a mitzvah. However, if we're living in a society in which we generally don't eat bread meals, perhaps we're more conscious of not wanting so much starch, and so on, you're not deliberately avoiding the mitzvah because you can't be bothered for it, this idea wouldn't apply. So it's certainly apparent that there's no particular obligation to pursue a mitzvah saseh, which is circumstantial, to put yourself into the obligation of it. And therefore, there's no obligation upon us to own land in Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shmitta. Nonetheless, it is to have the opportunity of the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael is certainly a good thing to do. We see that Moshe Rabbeinu was very distressed that he couldn't get into Eretz Yisrael, and one of the reasons he was distressed was not just because of the issue of Eretz Yisrael and living in Eretz Yisrael. Chazal say he was distressed because he wanted to fulfill the mitzvahs that are connected with the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, trumas and maasros, and therefore it would appear that fulfilling the agricultural mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael is a positive thing. However, these schemes in which people are given a share of land, it is not clear that they are actually fulfilling any positive mitzvahs. There are positive mitzvahs connected with Shmitta and negative mitzvahs, Isurim. Don't farm is not a fulfillment of a positive mitzvah. Farming is a negation, is a transgression. Declaring one's fruit, hefka, allowing anyone access, it is not clear whether it is a positive mitzvah or it is merely avoiding an issa of guarding the fruit. So when it comes to the context of Shmitta, if the land you have is grain or vegetative land, which will merely not be farmed, one isn't fulfilling a mitzvah by owning such land, one's just not transgressing anything, which is great. Don't transgress things, but there's no particular reason to buy the land to avoid transgressing things. If you don't own land, you're also not transgressing anything. If it is a fruit-producing orchard that one gets a share of, then maybe there's a positive mitzvah because I'm allowing anyone in, but even that isn't so clear-cut. It would appear rather to be a negative, an isra, say, of not transgressing the prohibition of blocking people rather than fulfilling anything in an absolute sense that is positive. So it is not clear-cut that there's any particularly powerful reason to own or purchase land in Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill the mitzvahs of Shmitta. If anything, the argument would go that the rest of the time there's better reason to own the land, so that one can fulfill what definitely are positive mitzvahs of taking truma and maisa, the tithing that takes place over fruit and vegetable in Eretz Yisrael. But these tithings don't occur in the Shmitta year. So if anything, for the other 6 years, there's more of a reason to own the land, and therefore, as such, fulfill the positive mitzvahs of trumas and maasros. So this is a halachic analysis of these schemes of owning a small portion of land in Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shmitta. Nonetheless, the primary purpose for these schemes is in order to support the farmers, and as I already mentioned, that's a worthy Tsedaka cause. So it is a good cause this year to give money towards the charities, the Tzedakas that are raising money for Shmitta. If it appeals to you and is an appealing way to fulfill the mitzvah for you, to own land in Eretz Yisrael and through that give a donation, that's fine. But in and of in itself, the schemes of owning land in Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill the mitzvah Shmitta are not that clear cut. There's no obligation to put oneself into circumstantial mitzvahs, though it is probably a good thing to do the mitzvahs of Tzilukas Varetz, the Eretz Yisrael mitzvahs. But equally with Shmitta, it would appear that the mitzvahs are those of avoiding negative commandments and prohibitions, lo saseh and isuri aseh, rather than clear-cut positive mitzvahs. And therefore, it is not obvious to me that owning land in Eretz Yisrael fulfills a mitzvah in this context, though there are many other good reasons to so do. The final point that maybe I'll discuss just in the time available is around some of the new technology, including hydroponics, which has been around for a long time, and aeroponics, which is much more recent technology. So hydroponic is basically fruit and vegetables that don't grow from the land, but grow from a nutrient soup. So a liquid soup full of the various nutrients and fruit and vegetables, vegetables primarily, grow from this hydroponic mix. Aeroponics are where there is no nutrient soup. They are growing from the air, not quite the thin air, but they look like they're growing from air. It's basically vegetables and herbs without any soil whatsoever, and they get the nutrients through a spraying system. The plant roots are sprayed with water and nutrients rather than as with hydroponics where the roots are actually submerged in a liquid. Why do farmers engage in hydroponics and aeroponics? There's lots of reasons. From a Jewish point of view, a halachic point of view, it's one of the best ways of growing insect-free vegetation, vegetables and herbs, and obviously we avoid insects and bugs. For the wider consumer market, there are non-Jews out there who also like the idea of avoiding insects and bugs, or like the idea of not needing pesticides and so on sprayed in their fruits and vegetables, and therefore this is the second advantage of this agricultural method. And the third advantage for this is because it's an effective way of making the deserts bloom. So in Eretz Yisrael, which is rich in fresh air and sunlight, but sometimes poor in fertile soil, this is a good way of using land to grow fertile crops, and it's an intensive form of farming. So what are the halachas in terms of Shmitta with these farmed products? Do the laws of Shmitta apply to them? So there are two halachas, two halachic sugyas to consider over here. The first is a discussion in classic sources, in Mishnaic sources, about fruit and vegetables which grow in pots. They always had plant plots. And the Mishnah discusses in many instances what is the status of fruit and vegetable growing in plant plots. It talks about two scenarios: an utsit nokov, which is a plant plot which has a hole in, and an utsit she'ena nokov, a plant plot which doesn't have a hole in. Now, in the source sheet, I printed various sources that address this. Because we're running short of time due to the technological delays, I'm not going to look at these inside, but I printed a Rambam in Hilchos Trumas, I printed a Mishnah in the Masechtas Shabbos, and there's many other sources I could have chosen, because this is a halachic discussion that comes up in many instances. With all the agricultural laws of Eretz Yisrael, if a fruit or a vegetable grows in the land of Israel, but not from the earth, the soil of Israel, because it's growing in a potted plant, does the Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael, the laws of Eretz Yisrael, apply to it? Similarly, with respect to Kalayim, one isn't allowed to grow in a vineyard vegetables if I have a potted plant in the vineyard. Is this considered attached to the ground or not? Similarly, with respect to Shabbos, if I uproot a plant from the ground, I'm transgressing harvesting on Shabbos. If I uproot it from a plant pot, is this prohibited as far as Torah law is concerned or not? And so on and so forth with many, many halachas. Is something which grows from a pot considered connected enough to the ground to be considered connected to Kedushas Eretz, to the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael and the laws that apply to that, and to be connected to the laws of Shabbos and Kalayim and Tum and Tara and various, and Trumas and Maisros and various other halachas. So the halachic consensus is that an utsit nokov, if it has a hole, a significant hole in the pot, I'm not going to discuss the details of how large a hole, that connects it to the ground sufficiently such that the laws of Eretz Yisrael and Shabbos would apply to it. If it is an utsit she'ena nokov, a pot without a hole in it, then the Torah laws, min ha-Torah, the laws will not apply, but there are rabbinic prohibitions that apply to it. So here these fruits and these vegetables, rather, that grow hydroponically or aeroponically are growing in a detached manner from the ground, and the halachic principle that would apply would be that of utsit nokov and utsit she'ena nokov, which would seem to imply that since they are potted without a hole in, the Torah prohibition of Shmitta would not apply. But in other areas, we do find rabbinic prohibitions. So you can't uproot a plant from a pot on Shabbos, even though min ha-Torah maybe it's allowed, but rabbinically it's not allowed. It is not clear if such a prohibition was created for Shmitta or not. Because Shmitta is an extraordinarily difficult halacha to keep, we have no explicit reference that says that these limitations apply to the laws of Shmitta also. Maybe the rabbinic prohibition, the Rabbanon, against even uprooting something which grows from a pot only applies to Shabbos and Trumas and Maasros, but not to Shmitta. This remains a little bit unresolved in halacha, but it's one point to ponder. Since they are growing removed from the soil of Eretz Yisrael, maybe the prohibition of Shmitta doesn't apply. There is a second halachic principle at work, which is very fascinating. And this is a Talmud Yerushalmi. So of our primary halachic sources, we generally learn the Talmud Bavli, the Gemara that was edited and compiled in Bavel. However, the Talmud Yerushalmi is a complex and important, albeit slightly secondary, classic source for halacha. Now, the Talmud Yerushalmi discusses a tree planted in a house. And again, I printed the source here in source 8. And in source 8, I printed this Talmud Yerushalmi. And the Gemara and the Talmud Yerushalmi discuss planting things in houses and what halachas apply to them. Now, the Gemara Bavli in Erevin talks about planting grain in a vineyard that is under a roof which extends outwards from a house. And the Gemara there seems to say quite clearly that the mitzvahs hatuluyos ba'aretz, agricultural mitzvahs, apply not just in outdoor fields, but even in indoors, like inside a house. So says the Gemara in Erevin. On the other hand, the Talmud Yerushalmi in Ala discusses the agricultural mitzvahs of Ala and Maisa and Shmitta. And the Yerushalmi seems to say that whereas Ala applies even to indoor growth, Maisa does not apply to indoor growth, and then it questions whether Shmitta applies to things which grow indoors. Now, why should there be a difference between Arla and Maisa? So Maisa is the mitzvah of tithing. Arla is the prohibition against eating fruit which grows on trees for the first 3 years. And the Yerushalmi explains it to us. And it says the crucial distinction is whether the prohibition in the Torah is that of Eretz, the land, in which case things growing indoors are still growing from the land, or is it a prohibition on the Sodeh, the field? In other words, not just about the raw earth from which things are growing, but it's about the functionality of the space. Is the space a Sodeh? Is the space a field? Or is the space a bias, a house? And the Yerushalmi analyzes the terms that the Torah uses, and it says that when it comes to Ma'aseh, it says that the halacha is a tithing of the field. A field, outdoor growth is a field. Indoor growth is a house. It's a bias. It's a house. It's a bias. If it grows from a house, not from a sodeh, the halacha of Ma'aseh doesn't apply. However, when it comes to Arla, the prohibition in the Torah, as a pasuk in Vayikra, says it's for a tree that grows in the land, when you enter into the land, and therefore says Yerushalmi, inside the house is still land, it's still growing from the land, and therefore the prohibition would apply. Now, if we look in our source sheet again, in source 1, when we look at the psukim, Yerushalmi points out that we have an unclear set of verses, an unclear set of psukim. If we look in pasuk base, Daber ben Yisrael v'martalem ki soveru ala oretz, v'shavsa oretz. The land should rest when you come to the land of Israel. So this seems to imply a land, even if it's whether it's indoors or whether it's outdoors. However, in pasuk Daled it says, again the land, it's the functionality of the space. It's a field which you shouldn't farm rather than just the land. And it's unclear what conclusion the Yerushalmi comes to. Does the Yerushalmi conclude that Shmitta applies to the land, in which case even inside a house would be included in the prohibition of Shmitta, or is the prohibition about Sodeh, a field, about the functionality of the space, in which case a land would not, a house indoors, the prohibition of Shmitta would not apply? The Yerushalmi's conclusion is a little unclear. However, misvara, it's not clear that this would be applicable to the hydroponic production. And here one needs a little bit of halachic shikul hadas and an assessment to make. What do we have over here with the hydroponics? We have a very extensive patch of land, sometimes even several acres, dedicated to farming, on the one hand, and on the other hand, roofed in. Is it a bayit? Is it a house? No, it isn't. Is its functionality as a growing space? Absolutely. On the other hand, is it a sodeh? When it's roofed, is it a field? It's roofed, and it's detached from the ground. It's a space in which I have a complex technological apparatus vats for things to grow from the nutrients if it's hydroponics, or suspension if it's aeroponics? Is this a sodeh? Also not clear. It's a dedicated space for growing, but not clear-cut as a sodeh. And therefore, this remains a halachic debate on two levels. Number one, upsit she'enu nokov, a plot which has no air hole in it, and therefore it's growing from a potted plant. Is this detached from the ground or not? Does the drabonon apply, or is this considered removed from Eretz Yisrael? And secondly, is this a sodeh or not? Is this a field or not? Because it's grown from a dedicated large space. It's not a bias, it's not a house. On the other hand, is it a sodeh? If it isn't a sodeh, what is the halacha with Shmitta? What is the determining factor in the prohibition of the Torah? Is it about oretz, ground, not being farmed on Shmitta? Or is it about sodeh? Is it about the human functionality that we create and the space that we designate with a certain functionality, and therefore wouldn't necessarily apply to the hydroponics? This remains a hot issue in Israel, with different hechsherim taking different stances. And I'm not going to go into a practical halachic conclusion without this, because it depends on many details about how this is farmed. I wanted just to finish off with two thoughts. The first is that I hope that both this shiur and the Shabbos Shuvah shiur revealed to us the degree to which the Kedushas Oretz and the Kedushas Shmitta is about the human-land relationship. It's not just about the raw land. We saw the postscript that said that Eretz Yisrael is only Eretz Yisrael when it is Eretz Shel Yisrael, when it's actually owned and farmed by a Jew, not just from the raw Kedusha that's associated with it. It's certainly about our connection to Eretz Yisrael. That was the very first point I made at the beginning of my first shiur on Shabbos Shuvah. The very final point I'm saying in this shiur is that the definition of the land is carved out by us. If we dedicate a space to be a bayit, then it doesn't have the halachas that apply to a sodeh. If we define a space as a sodeh, then it has the halachas that apply to a field. Again, telling us something about the human land interaction, and that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is not just the static Kedusha, but is about our ability to connect to it. The final point I want to make is something that I mentioned very briefly in the Joshua, I just want to reiterate now. We often have concerns here in Chutz La'aretz, so we somehow being disloyal to Eretz Yisrael by avoiding buying its fruits and vegetables over the Shmitta year. And I want to emphasize several-fold that this is not the case. We are not, God forbid, being disloyal to Eretz Yisrael. We obviously need to use tact and sensitivity to ensure that we're not being seen to boycott Tas Shalom Eretz Yisrael. But equally, this is our way to connect to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and to ensure that it has its Kedusha. And we can connect during the Shmitta. In other ways, we can make extra efforts to buy other products from Eretz Yisrael, other goods from Eretz Yisrael. We spoke about if one's lucky enough to own a garden or a house in Eretz Yisrael, and the halachas that apply. We spoke about the halachas that apply to fruits and that does arrive here from Eretz Yisrael, and the oats are based in concept. We spoke about Tsedaka being given to Eretz Yisrael, which is another way of supporting it. And finally, I conclude on the bottom of page 1 with sources from the Talmud, the Gemara in Tanis, and the Gemara in Shabbos, which tells us that it's the keeping of Shemitah which really keeps our connection to Eretz Yisrael and gives us the safety and security of ownership of Eretz Yisrael. As I said at the beginning of my Shabbos Shuvah drasha, this is because one of the ideas of Shmitta is the reminder that this is the land gifted to us, entrusted to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore our connection to Eretz Yisrael is really only secure through keeping its mitzvahs, and therefore for us to fulfill the mitzvahs of Shmitta here in Chutz La'aretz to the best of our ability is certainly important in ensuring the enduring safety and security of Eretz Yisrael, along with its Kedusha and along with our connection to it. So I will stop here. I apologize that I went a little over time given the technological delays. I hope that everyone who participated online managed to hear me, and I hope the people who are here live forgive me for the technological delays and the repetition that resulted for them. Thank you so much for joining. Okay, in answers to questions that were asked, asked about the borders of Eretz Yisrael that are applicable here. So there's, actually really it deserves a share in its own right, and maybe it's something I'll give later on in the year. But when we talk about the land of Israel, the borders of Eretz Yisrael, there's many borders that are given. There's the borders given actually next week's Sedra, in this week's Sedra, in Lech Lecha to Avraham Avinu. That's one set of borders. There's a second set of borders promised to Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, in the Midbar when they're about to enter Eretz Yisrael, the allocation of the land, and Pinchas, and various other sources. Then there's Eretz Yisrael that was actually conquered by Yehoshua. And then there's Eretz Yisrael that was conquered by the return of the exiles at the start of the second temple, the second Beis HaMikdash era, which was a very reduced land of Israel. And finally, there's the Eretz Yisrael promised to us in the Messianic era. And each of these have their own sets of borders and halachas which are dependent on them. But broadly speaking, in practical terms, in terms of the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael with respect to Shmitta and Trumas and Maitras, we use the smallest border of Eretz Yisrael, that of the return of the second temple exiles. The exiles post the Churban Beis HaMikdash returned to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. It's a very interesting topic why that is, but it connects with what we've spoken about just now at the end of the Shiur, that Eretz Yisrael is not just an abstract concept, but it's the potential as invested in the geography, as promised to Avraham and to the Jews when they were about to enter Eretz Yisrael in the Midbar, but actualized by the real possession of people. And therefore it's the real Eretz Yisrael actualized by the returnees at the time of the building of the second Beis HaMikdash, which gives it its permanent kedusha. So the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael with respect to the laws of Trumas and Maitras and Shmitta, the agricultural laws, is the most limited one. So even though the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is anywhere which is geographical Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the agricultural mitzvahs only apply to a much more limited space, and therefore somewhere to the south of Beersheva is the halachic border with respect to Shmitta. Exactly where that border lies is somewhat of a controversy. It's the Arava debate. The Arava is that's the name of that region south of Beersheva, and exactly where the border lies is different Tachsherim take different stances. I was asked about unlabeled fruit on the market. Unlabeled fruit on the market is sofek d'Rabbanan, it's doubt. One should try and clarify. If one is unable to determine its status, one does not need to be concerned that it has kedusha of Shemitah. I was asked about giving vegetables and fruit rather with kedusha Shemitah to children. As long as the children will eat it properly, one can give it to the children. And if you give it to them for a lunchtime snack and they return home with it and it's no longer, it hasn't been eaten, but it's no longer edible, then one can dispose of it in the ways that have been described. Fruit that grows in Shmitta does not have the normal laws of tithing of Trumas and Maitras. One does not need to take Trumas and Maitras. Fruit which is, or wine which is imported from Israel with a reliable hechsher and is based in will be labelled as such. Fruit and wines and other Israeli products, cakes and biscuits and so on, you need to ensure that they have a good mahadrin hechsher, otherwise it might be heter mechira, and as explained, we in Chutz don't get drawn into the heter mechira debate. Labelling will normally allow you to know which hechsher it is and which whether it is based in as discussed. I was asked about which fruit and vegetables qualify as fruit and so are allowed but should be eaten with the sanctity of Shemitah, and which are vegetables and therefore are suffichin and rabbinically prohibited. And the answer is it's not quite the same as ha'etz and ha'adama. Anything which is grown from a seed or a grain or planted annually was included in the prohibition of sfichin, because as explained, since it needs planting, it doesn't generally grow by itself. However, the prohibition of sfichin is not extended to fruits on trees, nor other perennial crops, even if they are not in halacha viewed as fruits of trees. So bananas and strawberries, which are perennial and therefore grow even without planting, therefore have less of an incentive for a cheating farmer. The prohibition of sfichin does not apply to them, and these are treated like fruit and can be eaten with the kedusha of Shemitah. To clarify about wine and grape juice. These are products that if you buy in the shops from June next year or so, if they are from a regular non-mahadrin hechsher, could be heter mechira, and if they are from a mahadrin hechsher, may well be otzer based in, to look out for the labelling in those circumstances. If they are otzer based in, then they need to be consumed with kedusha, as discussed. In other words, treated with respect, not wasted, and so on. And that's from June next year. I was also asked about how biur, this concept of not hoarding but declaring hefka, applies once it's no longer available in the marketplace, in the field. Normally speaking, with wine, there isn't much of a window of opportunity where this applies, since by the time we get it in Chutz, it has already long past being available in the fields in Israel, and therefore it was in the possession of Beis Din at the Zaman Biur at the time when hoarding became prohibited, because it's no longer available in the field. There's quite a small window in between where we might get it and where it might still be available in the field. So Biur generally isn't so applicable. However, it needs to be sold by a shop that understands the concept of Otzer Beis Din and therefore is not selling it but distributing it for a cheaper price and only taking costs for storage and delivery and so on, but not making a profit on it. So the shop has to understand the concept of Otzer Beis Din. Also, otherwise one is purchasing Shmitta, which it produce fruit, which is forbidden. So I hope that clarifies that. I think that brings me to the end of the questions, and therefore I'll stop there. Thank you again so much for joining. Really appreciate it.